pressure hydrometallurgy.
Thank you very much for that introduction. My friends at OPAC said I'm wearing Besiktas colors today, but if I knew how they were playing this year, I would have had a yellow shirt on today. So anyway, I don't know a lot about Turkish soccer, but what I do know a little bit about that's why I'm willing to talk about the future of pressure hydrometallurgy. But before I start, I'd just like to congratulate the organizers of this conference. And it's a really very well organized conference, a lot larger than I expected it. And congratulations. Also, thank you very much for the opportunity to be a speaker at the conference. I look at the other keynote speakers, and I'm in very renowned company and prestigious company, and that humbles me. But it's really nice to be here, and thank you very much especially to Professor Emre Altun. I don't see him here this morning, but he'll be around, I'm sure. So the title of pressure hydrometallurgy, to start off on the future. The future is not science, so this presentation will be full of opinion, my own opinion, and I plan on taking the presentation and putting it in an envelope with the delegate list, all 1,200 people in the same envelope, and then opening it up in November 2033 and see if I was right or wrong. And if I was right, I'm going to email everybody and say I told you so, okay? But I've been involved in this industry long enough to know the chances of me being 100% right is absolutely zero, all right? So then pressure hydrometallurgy sounds very impressive, but at the end of the day, I'm talking about autoclaves. And there's a lot of autoclaves. There's medical autoclaves, there's rubber curing autoclaves. I'm talking about the autoclaves in the mining and hydrometallurgy industry. And the definition is a reactor operating at elevated pressure and temperature, containing all three phases of matter and used in the metallurgical industry. That sounds very formal, but that's what I'm talking about. And people would ask now, why do we need autoclaves in the industry? Because it improves the reaction kinetics. It makes things happen faster. The reactions, chemical reactions, happens faster at elevated temperature and higher oxygen overpressure. But it also modifies equilibrium. I'm going to talk a little bit, explain that a little bit in a slide or two. But at the end of the day, it increases the likelihood of the preferred reaction in the best possible time. Now, I'm a chemical engineer, and we're unfortunately constrained by mechanical boundaries. Mechanical engineers constrain us. If we could have operated at 500 degrees C and 20 bar oxygen overpressure, we would love to be there, but unfortunately the mechanical engineers don't like that. So it's the best possible time within the constraints that we have. Essentially, there's two main autoclave processes. The one that you put oxygen in, and that's pressure oxidizing autoclaves, or POX autoclaves for short. And the ones that you don't put any oxygen in. And that is a leaching process, and for all the mining guys in here, all the mining engineers, leaching means dissolving, right? The process engineers like myself like to talk other words, so just to confuse the mining engineers. So you can leach it in, dissolve something in acid or an alkaline, but at a high pressure it dissolves better. POX autoclaves is all about the oxidizing of sulfur. It takes sulfur from a -2 state to a +6 state, And it happens in nature. Pyrite oxidizes in nature and creates acid mine drainage. It takes 100 years. You put it under pressure, and at 230 degrees, it takes 30 minutes. So this is an example of where kinetics is the important thing. Now, why do we actually oxidize the sulfur? Because in the sulfur, you actually trap some gold. And the cyanide solution, yesterday's talk about the cyanide leaching, can't get to the gold. So if we oxidize the sulfur, what happens? It becomes porous, and you can actually get to, the cyanide can get to the gold. So POX is all about changing what's on the left. That's the a scanning electron microscope image of the feed of an autoclave. And on the right is the discharge. So that's what POX is all about. HPAL is all about equilibrium. So we try to dissolve about 1.5% nickel in an ore that contains about 30% iron. And if we do it in atmospheric conditions, considering that we have to put a lot of acid in there to dissolve the nickel, but if we do it between 40 and 100 degrees C, we're in that region where iron is actually soluble, and it's soluble as a ferric iron and as a ferric sulfate. So it basically consumes acid. However, if we operate at 250 degrees, we're in the hematite zone. Now, hematite is iron oxide hydroxide, but there's no sulfates. So the iron does not consume acid. It may dissolve, but reprecipitate as a hematite and give you the acid back. So at that point, so that is why in HPAL, it's important to operate at 280. And this is an example of what the equilibrium implications have to a reaction. Okay, so to understand where we're going, it's always nice to see where we are now and to look a little bit back into history. So currently, there's more than 100 POX sites. Now, this is POX sites. This is not autoclaves. Some of those sites have got 6, 8 autoclaves on the site. So there's about 100 sites that was designed over the years and actually implemented and built and is operated. A lot of those sites have now shut down, but definitely more than half of them are still operating, right? And they're mostly gold, but there's also copper POX, there's zinc POX, valerite POX, nickel sulfide POX, molybdenum, and mixed sulfides, which is a precipitate that is re-leached, so that's also a POX process. So there's a lot of those ones, but it's mostly gold. HPAL, there's less than 20 sites. And as a matter of fact, the last 4 years, there's about 4 or 5 that's been added, and it's still under 20. So, you know, you can be, you can be forgiven for saying that POX is older than HPAL, but essentially HPAL is actually the older than POX. The first HPAL large plant that was installed was in Moa Bay in Cuba in '59. Incidentally, that plant is still running. There's a photo of it. It doesn't look like autoclaves, modern autoclaves. They're Pachuca autoclaves. They're carbon steel brick lined, which is also unique. It's not like we have today. But they're still operating. They're still producing nickel. So that's the first generation HPAL plant. And after that, there was a bunch of uranium plants in the 70s. They all shut down. And then the second generation plants were in the 90s. Those were the 3 ones, Maran, Kors, Boulong, and was largely seen as not successful, right? Although, having said that, Maran, which is now called Manara, is still operating today and is actually operating above nameplate. So one of those 3 plants actually made it. The joke is that it's called Maran because it was engineered twice, right? So there's a lot of fixes in that plant to get it to run today. The third generation plant, there was mixed success. Those were the Ravensthorpe, Gordis here in Turkey, Goro and Batavi, Those were the Ramu, Tanganito, those were the third generation plants, and they were mixed success. Some of them were seen as huge successes, other ones were struggling to get to nameplate capacity and actually had to settle for less than nameplate capacity or high operating cost. And now the fourth generation plants is the ones that came online in the past 4 or 5 years. Those were the Indonesian plants, mainly or exclusively actually Chinese designed and operated. They could be seen as a success, right? So HPAL is older, although there's a lot less sites. So I'm going to carry on with my predictions about HPAL. So looking a little bit back in history, this is the startup of a lot of those first generation and second generation, or second generation and third generation plants. As you can see, there's not a lot of them that actually got to 100%. And it took a few years, right, 5 years to get to sometimes up to close to design. This did not give the HPAL industry a very good name, but the fourth generation plants have started up very, very well. Now you're not talking about years, you're actually talking about months. And this is production orientated. It's not throughput orientated. Most of these plants we involved, as Caldera involved with these plants, they started up within months, running at capacity on throughput. So this is production orientated. And as you can see, you're talking about quarters and not months. So you're talking about a set of 6 to 9 months for these plants to reach capacity. Now, the Western engineering companies and the Western people were looking at this and a little bit, I think, jealous in some instances. So that's why there were some, LinkedIn comments about, yes, but, it's actually more 12 months or 9 months than 3 months. And, you wonder what they're doing with the tailings dam. And, keep in mind that they're only making MHP, which is intermediate product, not final metal. And it's all valid comments, but a lot of it is actually, in my mind, almost jealousy. If the Chinese could actually do something that Western companies could not do. But some of it is justified. Quite recently, some of these photos have come out about the tailings, where people were saying, what about the tailings environmentally? So these new plants, although successful and running quite well, will have some pushback from the local communities, right? But having a look at the success story, and I think this is going to be the future for HPAL, there's a few things that these plants all had in common. They had a modular design that was based on Ramu. I'm talking about the autoclave section. So the autoclave section of Ramu took some time to start up, but was not the biggest problem at Ramu. Ramu had more problems on the feed side, on the beneficiation mining side than actually autoclave side. So they took what was good at Ramu and they just copied it. No process development and longer and looking at pilot plants. They took a good design and they copied it, a modular approach. They got simple flow sheets. The making MHP intermediate product may be seen as a disadvantage by some, but I see it as an advantage. These guys make an intermediate product on some island somewhere in Indonesia, and they ship it to, place in civilization where they can actually change that MHP into battery-grade nickel sulfate or metal. That makes sense. Don't try and make have a refinery on the middle of nowhere in Indonesia. And it's actually proven at Goro as well. Goro made all the way metal. And Goro struggled with making money and getting everything balanced. And the expertise required where Goro was located. So Goro actually slimmed down their process and only making intermediate products and then shipping the intermediate products out. And since then, they've actually been operating a lot better. So I can see Any new HPAL plant will probably concentrate on intermediates rather than going all the way down to metal. They use proven suppliers, which is quite interesting, you know. People knock sometimes the Chinese for stealing intellectual property and stuff, but these engineering companies and these companies have actually understood that some of the mechanical equipment required is very specialized, and the mechanical equipment people like Caldera has actually invested a huge amount of time and effort to make the products better and last longer in this very severe environment. So despite the fact that they were Chinese built and designed, they actually procured quite a lot of Western proven equipment, and they did not compromise on that. There was no such thing as going out on 3 inquiries and you know, motivating a technical adjudication. What worked at Ramu were implemented in these plants. They all had some form of beneficiation or screening of the feed. So they do upgrade the feed, and they discard some of the chromite and some of the low-grade nickel to increase their grade into the plant and to also make the feed into the plant finer. Now that's got extremely good influence on the feed pump valves, the gear pump valves, and also on the wear of the titanium vessels. So these guys have learned quite a lot from Ramu, and that came from Ramu. There was a lot of upfront beneficiation and screening work done at Ramu. Also, their operating philosophy. Steady operations is king in these plants. They have a slow ramp up and a slow ramp down. They take it up to about 180 degrees, and then they start the process and ramp it up to 250. And when they shut it down from 250 back to 180 before they start closing isolation valves and changing, you know, and shutting down. So their ramp up and ramp down is very slow. The operation is very steady. They know that, you know, it helps, it's king to keep things steady. What's nice for a supplier like Caldera Engineering to do fault finding is that every shift starts up that plant exactly according to the operating manual. They do not waver from startup procedures, which means they do things exactly the same way every day, and every time they start up and every time they shut down, which is good for fault finding. What we have found in some of the Western plants is that every shift kind of start up the plant their own way, right? They start up, and one starts it up in 6 hours, the other one rushes it, other one takes 12 hours, and every shift seems to have their own way of method of starting or shutting down a plant, which is problematic if you want to do some fault finding if something broke. They also understand the value of experienced staff. So they took some of these Ramu people and they took them into these operations. And that's another issue, is that quite often some of the Western plants, there's a fly in and a fly out arrangement where experienced staff flies in for a few weeks, then flies out for a few weeks. Some of these plants have got the key personnel go to site for 2 years. They don't go home for 2 years. They stay on that site for 2 years and ramp that place up. They know that place inside out, and there's no swing shift or shift. You stay there for 2 years. They've got extremely well experienced staff. And then there's an emphasis on overpressure. So in the autoclave, overpressure cannot be understated for the health of the total health of the plant, including the discharge system. So they actually have all got systems that introduce artificial overpressure into the autoclave. It's a little bit technical, I'm going in there now, but at the end of the day, on the right is a Caldera plug that's been operating for 18 months. And that's the ceramic section. So it's operated for 18 months. That same plug was put in, has now been operating for another 18 months. So that's 3 years for one level control valve, which is amazing compared to some of the sites. Gordis actually is not doing too badly, I have to say. But there's some HPAL plants that it literally lasts for about 3 to 6 months, right? Now, the outlook on the 4th generation plants, or HPAL in general, right? There's talk about, you know, nickel surplus and the over demand, and did they put in too much capacity in too short period of time? And that's quite recently. That's in June 2023, and we all know the nickel price have been, you know, has gone down. I think it's sitting now at about $16,000 per ton. It's getting dangerously close to the $12, $13 a ton, where a lot of these operations are breaking even. So it is a problem that there could be nickel surplus. And then there's the threat of other sources, right? So I'm going to show this slide, and I'm going to show the next slide, but just read the second slide. It says to take nickel pig iron. Now, nickel pig iron, NPI, is the cheapest way of producing nickel from serpentine laterite ore. It is very crude, it's very cheap. You can produce nickel for about $5,000 to $6,000 per ton. And the statement these guys are making is that for less than $5,000 a ton, you can make nickel metal out of nickel pig iron, which is completely in contradiction with this slide. So nickel briquettes, for all intents and purposes, is pure nickel metal, nickel briquettes or nickel cathode. To change nickel briquettes into conversion as a nickel sulfate to be used in batteries cost very little. Is this a... there we go. Oh. But as you can see, nickel briquettes is there in the range of $10,000 to $12,000, and for another $1,000 you can have nickel sulfate. MHP costs a little bit more, which it doesn't make sense. I thought nickel briquettes would take a little bit more, but it also has got a portion to take it to nickel sulfate. NPI costs $5,000. 6,000. Now, if you add another 5,000 onto NPI to get to metal, you're sitting in the range of $10,000 to $12,000, which means you can maybe make nickel sulfate for battery grade for under $10,000, $12,000, $13,000, which is a risk, because now NPI, which is a pyromet, possibly could compete into feed for batteries. So these slides are in the public domain. They do contradict each other, but at the end of the day, I think HPAL is going to slow down a little bit. I don't think we're going to have the growth for the next few years that we had in HPAL. But we'll get to the conclusion and my predictions at the end. Regarding POX have been slowly evolving over the years. Like I said, there's 100 plants. I've never seen one POX plant which is the same. There's always this discrepancy of whole ore versus a concentrate. Whole ore makes more sense if the gold price is high. Concentrate makes more sense if you want to have a stage capital investment. We're seeing more high mass pull or enriched ore plants coming in the world. Materials construction is evolving. Titanium spargers are coming back. That's a titanium sparger with super duplex insert, which is suddenly being used now. So I think titanium, that's a titanium sparge tube. It's got titanium on the outside and ceramic on the inside. So there's a lot of work being done to actually see, on materials of construction in the POX plant. I can see POX continuously evolving and improving over the next 10 years. CFDs are being used. My good friend John is going to have a presentation on Friday on CFDs, but CFDs are now being used in POX and to improve the designs. The top one there is a vent cyclone, which is used for cleaning flash steam from a flash tanks. So you can make the flash tank smaller and then have a vent cyclone to give you the efficiency. The bottom one is some CFDs we've been doing to have a look at how quickly or the first to actually remove walls in the first compartment. Does the first compartment acts like a completely homogeneous mixing, or does it act as a plug reactor, because it's got an impact on the retention time in the first compartment? So that's the work we've been doing there. Now, to conclude, I think HPL industry will be seen as an established technology going forward. I don't think people will be scared of HPL technology. I think they're going to stay with the recipe for success, like the other fourth generation plants. But I do think nickel and cobalt laterite projects will decline from the huge growth that we've seen in the past 5 years. I think there will be a slowdown. At one stage there was talk about 30 new trains. That's coming down to 12, 15 trains in the Indonesia. However, there will be other commodities like lithium and uranium coming back. There's already 1 or 2 lithium autoclave projects that's busy being executed. And if you look at renewable energy and electricity, I think you can't discard uranium. So I think there's going to be some uranium autoclaves coming back. But the uranium and lithium will never be as big as the nickel cobalt laterites, just because there's alternative technologies. You can extract lithium out of brine, you can do lithium on atmospheric leach, and the same with uranium, depending on the mineral. On the POX industry, it's been proven technology for a long time. It will continue to evolve, and the growth will be steady and regional. And I'll just talk a little bit about regional growth. This is how POX industry actually grew. The first POX plant in Canada, and before you knew it, there were 6 POX plants in Canada. Then North America. The first POX plant went into North America. Then there was 6, 7, 8 POX plants in North America. Even Russia. Now, what's happening here in Turkey and the Middle East, there's now 3 autoclave plants in Turkey and 1 in Saudi Arabia. I can see there's going to be growth in Turkey and the Middle East. And one of the predictions I'm making is that there's going to be probably between 2 and 4 plants being built by 2033. So that's the prediction I'm making. I found that I've been a consultant to any one of the 3 sites at a given point in time. I found that the engineering personnel, the engineers of Turkey, number one, I found them to be very technically astute. They have very high technical capability, but they're also practical. I found them to be very practical, not impractical, just theoretical. But one thing I found them is I found them to be challenging and inquisitive. You can't just explain to them something, they want to know why. They want to know why, and they want to go into depth. And I always said to them that you can ask me now a lot of questions and I might know more than you, but give it 2 years and you're going to know this plant more than me, and I'm going to be the student and you're going to be the master, and you're going to tell me what's happening in your plant and give me more experience. And to be honest, it became true in all 3 of the sites. So number one, I think you have actually established operational excellence with your engineers. The second step to that is to have design. If you have enough operating experience, you can actually now start designing things. And there's Turkish engineers being involved in designs the rest of the world. So you actually got to that capability of doing a design. But now you also got a pilot plant. So Professor Emery Altoon has now got a pilot plant. Now you actually the next step, which is process development, which sets up this area of the world for growth in autoclaves, right? So that's my talk. We'll see in 10 years' time. I've been wrong in the past. I'm a married man, so I was wrong this morning, and so my wife told me, so I'm quite used to being wrong. But I would love to actually one-on-one with you and actually find out what your perspective is for the next 10 years of the autoclave industry. Thank you very much.
We thank you for your very interesting presentation. We have some gifts in memory of today. So our second talk will be delivered by Professor Glass. Professor Glass took his Master of Science degree in Chemical Engineering, PhD degree in Material Science. He's an expert in recycling and also Professor of Mining and Minerals Engineering since 2001 at Cameron School of Mines in Exeter University. His talk will be on innovation in mine planning and design. Thank you.
Thank you for this introduction. And I would like to start by expressing how pleased I am to have this opportunity today to address you. It's a real privilege and honor. And I would also like to commend the excellent organization of Professor Emery Altoon of this enormously prestigious event. I will, first of all, take you to where I come from, which is basically a place called Cambourne in Cornwall, which is located on the peninsula on the, in the bottom left of the UK. This place has a long history of mining, thanks to a very promising geology. And so you can see here in the geological map that the red outcrops or plutons have been the places where the Earth has come through protruded through the crust, creating pathways for mineralized fluids to precipitate. And yeah, this has obviously been not gone unnoticed since ancient times. You can see on the picture on the right a ceremonial burial site, which already goes back to the ages of the Bronze Ages and before that, when people were really interested in these metals. Clearly, the mining came and went on a larger scale, and what is mainly left are these engine houses, which are a testament to the former mining past of Cornwall. And for a long time, it has mainly been something which attracts the tourists as opposed to the miners. So, why do I reflect on the past? Well, along came critical metals and minerals, and all of a sudden we see a huge flurry of activity in Cornwall, which relates to a lot of metals, but also minerals, which are now considered to be critical, and the importance of the critical mineral supply chain is now starting to create exploration activity and hopefully lead to future mining. So very close to home, we have an opportunity to think how we can do this in such a way that we can improve on how it was done in the past, how we can make things better, and that is also partly what is the reason for my talk today in relation to mine planning and how we can innovate So what I would like to talk about is, first of all, mine planning, of course, is a very large topic. So I'm going to try and focus on what I think are the main commodities, the largest tonnages, the most prominent commodities. And obviously it's also a topic which is not so easily done on the back of an envelope anymore. We have to think here in terms of how we can use advanced techniques. And what I would like to do today is effectively to explore an algorithm which has been around for some time, but clearly which is based on its longevity, very good at what it's supposed to do. And that's something which I would like to bring to make a little bit more, shall we say, tangible by actually showing that this algorithm can actually be translated to a couple of slides on in this presentation, and also then highlighting potentially the strength of this approach, but potentially also the weaknesses or the areas where we could possibly improve in terms of the way in which we take this algorithm forward into the future. I won't be talking about autonomous trucks. Clearly, the picture here on the right suggests that there are many aspects which, of course, are under significant development in our industry. This is going to be largely about the strategic phase when we are talking about how to dimension a project. So I've actually picked on hard rock commodities. If you look in terms of where the commodities come from, many of the various metals are predominantly coming from hard rock sources. Some of these metals might also be found from soft rock sources, but copper, molybdenum, lead, zinc, iron, gold, platinum, even lithium, a lot of these, the majority of the tonnages of these commodities are actually obtained from hard rock. Hard rock being clearly something which has an igneous or metamorphic rock type, and which requires clearly some additional processing to it in order to liberate the material. So, if we talk in terms of then the hard rock commodity mining, the vast majority of that hard rock comes from open pit mines. Clearly this may not be like that forever, but in the current state, 60–70% of all these commodities, hard rock commodities, are coming through drilling and blasting after we have removed obviously the overburden, as the picture shows here. So we generally are talking about here deposits which are outcropping close to the surface, or sufficiently close to the surface, and which are generally of a large shape and suitable orientation. We have here, in other words, the stage set. So I will be talking, in other words, about the mine planning and design of hard rock commodities in open pit mines, as these are, in terms of both tonnage and significance, currently by far the most predominant in terms of their the types of techniques which commodities which are being mined. Now, clearly we need to think in terms of using software, and we would do that typically across the resource estimation, mining and mineral processing stages of the volume chain. I've put here some software packages which I am familiar with. I apologize if there are packages here which I should have perhaps included, but do feel free to reach out to me afterwards so that I can update the slide if you feel that there are packages which should also deserve a place in this overview. What we have here is clearly on the left-hand side, specialist resource estimation software. Sequent is in other words for leapfrog, which is basically a slightly disruptive way of doing estimation. Imcet's Neo is the reference software for estimation, although these days very much so for simulation. And these packages generally feed into the more generic mine planning and design software packages shown in the middle column. So I've made there's a little porous line here, which basically shows that these packages are, in other words, interrelated. The more generic packages, like which which are used for the mine planning and design are these days also largely able to do the estimation and of course are very much used for delineating the geology in the form of creating solids and subdomainin these and making, in other words, a mine schedule. So for some of these aspects, we do need more specific software. So in the bottom right corner, I've also made a mention here for Holcim and Mining Math, which again deal with specific aspects of how we can basically utilize our production equipment to the most efficient way. If you move to the right-hand side, however, I would like to point out that I've made mainly a kind of a fairly solid line here. And that is because a lot of the mine planning and design software packages don't necessarily take on board all the mineral processing and vice versa. This is, I think, still something where hopefully in the future we will see more integration. In other words, where that it will be possible to do resource estimation, mining and mineral processing in a way which allows us to obtain the benefits of all the harmonization and integration of these stages bring with it. At the right in the bottom corner, I have placed Kancha software, a geometallurgical software package, which purports to have to be bridging this gap. But clearly, I think that this is still an area which, in many ways, mine planning could benefit from if, in other words, all the processing routes can be integrated into the mine planning stages and possibly even upstream of the mine planning into the resource estimation stages. So, starting with resource estimation, clearly the exploration of the ore body, it requires that we block our ore body, even if we only have limited amounts of data, and the block volume would be determined by the contained metal and metallurgical recovery, price considerations, and the cost of mining and processing. This is fairly standard practice, but clearly how do we take this now forward into mine planning and design? Well, a key parameter, which is clearly something which needs to be identified upfront, will be related to what we consider to be a feasible pit slope angle, which will be determined by the strength of our rocks, the surrounding country rock, what's the stresses, and also hydrogeological conditions. And clearly we need to, this will be an input which we need to put into our resource model before we can take it to the strategic mine planning stage. And just to show you how we do that, once we have determined our, in this case, our pit slope, we will take our blocks, whatever blocks we used in our resource modeling stage, and reblock those in such a way that we can actually recreate the pit slope angle if we are going to be looking at doing an elementary form of, in this case, mine planning based on what we will be discussing in the next few slides. So effectively, this compositing is effectively a kind of averaging, whereby we like to think that the new blocks will still have representative properties, but they will enable us to create pits with the right slope angle. So the first step we do, once we have reblocked our, in this case, our material, in other words, into suitable blocks, is to determine what is called the ultimate pit limit. And we will use for that the Lurch-Grossman method, which is a successor to the so-called moving cone algorithm. And the ultimate pit limit, like the name implies, means that we will be looking at what is considered at a given point in time to be the maximum extent of what we would like to develop as part of our open pit operation. It's been around for quite a while, this method. It was first published in 1965. It was programmed for the first time by somebody called Jeff Whittle, popularized in various handbooks, and people are still trying to find variants of it. But it is a testimonial to the robustness of this technique that despite the fact that it was first proposed in 1965, that it is still very much at the heart of most scheduling and sequencing packages which are being used in the mining industry today. So despite all the best efforts to come up with something better, it is actually a really powerful technique. That doesn't mean to say that we don't want to have a very good look at it today to identify whether we may want to adjust or seek ways of improving its application. So just to give you a bit of a flavor, it's a three-dimensional special technique whereby we will, in the full version, look at whether we extract an underlying block based on the value of the blocks which provide access, which could either be 5 as shown on the left or 9 as shown on in the middle. And if you want to keep it a little bit more straightforward, we could also say, well, let's just look at a section with a thickness of 1 block, and in which case we will consider the 3 underlying, the 3 overlying blocks, in this case as in terms of their propensity for being part of the open pit. And that's potentially not too complicated to explain. However, if I want to do this with you here today in a 2-dimensional slide, I'm going to just stick to a very nice symmetric case. A lot of mines have very nice truncated cone shapes, and we could potentially say, well, if we take a section which would have the same properties in all directions, rotated around the center, we could potentially put this into a spreadsheet and see how this basically works if we are going to be applying the Lurch-Grossman method. So without further ado, effectively we're talking just about 4 very simple steps. And clearly you can see these steps do not really think about the mining optimization as a physical process. This is a graph theory, whereby we will initially start with a very standard step, which is basically taking the net volume of each block in the block model. This is something we would do anyway, be it through a cut-off grade or through some equivalent grade or some other measure of volume. But here comes the first distinctive step. The second step is that we create accumulations of the block volume in vertical columns in the block model. So step number 2, we add the volume as we go down. I'm not going to go into derivation of the Lurch-Grossman method today, because that actually distracts a little bit from this application. What I would like to do, however, to show you that it is 3 incredibly straightforward steps which actually lead to the result, which is effectively very useful from the mining perspective. So the next step would be that we use a so-called memory effect, working from left to right, whereby we take the block volume based on the accumulations and add the highest volume, be it from the block to the left above, to the block to the left on the same height, or the block below to the left, and that will create a new volume in step number 3 for every block. So unless we have one of the edge blocks, we can do this for every block in our 2-dimensional representation. Finally, we will then reverse this process by starting at the right-hand side and looking for the maximum volume in the top level. And that will allow us to, again, follow a process whereby we will take the maximum volume, which is either above, at the same height, or below the block to the right. And that's how we will create our pit outline, our ultimate pit outline. So effectively, this is shown with some numbers here. Obviously, I promised I was going to do this in Excel with you. So here's basically the same principles, but now applied in a spreadsheet. So I've taken some grades here, and I've delineated these grades. So everything which is here assigned is basically outside of the ore body. So so one of the things which you see, if you want to apply the Lurch-Grossman, is you need to make a very clear distinction in advance what you think will be processed and what will not be processed. You need to understand the routing of the ore. This is something which is not necessarily, again, showing that we are going to be looking at how the ore is mined. This is purely in other words, a decision we need to make well in advance of this application. We will then do the net volume determination, which will be positive in the case of if it's inside the ore body, and if it's outside the ore body, it will be negative. So I have here translated all the volumes inside the colored sections into positive volumes, and everything outside is just simply, if that was to be mined, it would create a negative cost for the project. Now we do the vertical accumulation, and the vertical accumulation, in other words, if we are outside the ore body, will become increasingly negative. So this is a disincentive for that material to be mined. However, if we stay inside the ore body, the ultimate amount of volume generated will increase. So clearly, based on the location of that ore body, you can see here that the material in the center will become will have the higher accumulations as opposed to the material to the edges, which is outside of the ore body. And then finally, when we do the memory effect, you can see that the color pattern shifts slightly. In other words, we are going from left to right, and this has to be now corrected by going back from right to left. In other words, what we want to see is that we create a pit which effectively is centered logically on what we would consider to be our ore body as we had defined it in advance. Clearly, the starting point will be determined in the top right corner, and as long as the volume increases as we go deeper, the ultimate pit limits will, in other words, be deepened. Clearly, in this case, not all of the ore body is included, and that is obviously because too much material which would be considered to be waste would otherwise be routed well, be excavated for the given pit slope angle and the given geometry of the ore body. At this point, this suggests that this particular algorithm might not be the only algorithm we need if we are going to be identifying how to mine this ore body. We may want to think also in terms of identifying when we need to transition to underground mining, in other words, to access the valuable parts of the ore body which are not economically mineable through open pit operations. So, clearly this is a very static representation. If we want to do something which basically has, in this case, the opportunity to create a time-based mining sequence or extraction sequence, we need to potentially find ways of making scheduling or sequencing inside this ultimate pit limit. And a very straightforward way is to reuse the Lurch-Grossman algorithm. So the Lurch-Grossman algorithm can potentially be reapplied, but we could simply artificially increase the cost of mining and processing, which will naturally reduce the size of the pit. So we will effectively, by increasing the cost of mining and processing in a virtual sense, we can create a whole series of pits inside the ultimate pit limit. And those nested pits would effectively give us an indication of how we should dimension our pushbacks, or even how we should even start our, in this case, development of our large open pit. This is a very common technique, but it's clearly it still requires now that we have a time-based sequencing inside these different shells, which clearly again opens up a whole new, well, in this case, set of options. So, a number of observations. First of all, if we have successive nested pits, we're unlikely to define equal tonnages, which means that we will have different pushbacks of different sizes. This is not necessarily helpful if you have a fixed production capacity and a fixed amount of material which you would like to process in a certain given, or plan in a given period of time. In other words, we would have the time for pushbacks would be highly variable. A second issue is that if we trust purely the mathematical, non-mining related Lurch-Grossman algorithm for identifying how we need to define our pushbacks, it might not necessarily lead to, in this case, feasible sequences, purely on the basis of geometry, purely on the basis of, in other words, infeasible transitions between the different sections of our, in this case, ultimate pits. So efficient extraction, in other words, is also not something which is not necessarily factored into what is the Lurch-Grossman algorithm. And finally, we have of course got an issue or uncertainty related to the shape of these nested pits. Over time, we may encounter geological variability which we didn't expect. There may be differences in the externalities like structural trends in interest rates, commodity prices, demand, And yeah, these things may actually also, if we rerun our Lurch-Grossman, may show up that our initial planning was perhaps optimistic or perhaps conservative. We may also change to underground mining or changes to extraction practices, in other words, in terms of production equipment, which again will lead to these particular original plans having to be modified and updated. What is clear is that we have here, in other words, an arena where we need to think very carefully how we would like to use the Lurch-Grossman in a mining context. So what I would like to talk to you about now, briefly, is the outlook for innovation using the Lurch-Grossman. Clearly, the current practice to establish the ultimate pit limits is a very useful step in a strategic mine planning sense. And this would typically be done during the pre-feasibility study of a mining project. However, the ultimate pit limit is independent of the time taken to mine the ore body. There is no discounting of volume, but then technically discounting of volume is generally something which is done in order to assess the, shall we say, appetite for risk for a project. Physically, of course, the ultimate pit limit algorithm is based on volume. If, in other words, can we make a viable mine? In other words, is there profit to be made over time, irrespective of when that profit is realized? We have some way of trying to develop time-based extraction sequences using the so-called nested pits. And yeah, this is also a practical way to effectively create something of a time-based sequence. But again, this is still very remote from where we really need to be if we are talking about an integrated approach to the mining volume chain. So let's therefore have a quick look at what underlies the whole Lurch-Grossman algorithm. And that was basically the block volume, whereby we have a static calculation of block volume. We have made decisions in advance of the Lurch-Grossman application in terms of whether we're going to process a block or not. So what I would suggest that we should think about is by using a more dynamic block volume. And when I talk about dynamic or time-based, the clear implication is that we need to start thinking about what is going to happen if we start processing this block. Is the amount of time required to crush the block going to be constant? Is the amount of time to grind the ore going to be constant? Are we dealing with ore of a constant hardness, or are we talking about ore which might require, in other words, a longer time in the circuit before it is ready for beneficiation using flotation or other processing techniques? This is clearly something which could vary locally within a deposit and an ore body, and which would therefore need some way of recognition in this particular processing system. So what I basically suggest is that instead of just looking at block volume at face volume, let's divide the block volume by the time required to process a block. And to be honest, this, for all practical purposes, this could also include the time required to extract the block. In other words, if you go deeper, you might have it might take a longer time to bring this material to the surface. Clearly, this creates a whole new type of parameter. This is not necessarily block volume on itself, but this is a kind of block productivity. Block productivity, in other words, is showing how much we can actually use this ore to the best effect in terms of the capacity and in terms of the throughputs which we are monitoring. So, in reality, I'm not saying we should change the Lurch-Grossman algorithm in itself. What I think we should do, however, is rerun the Lurch-Grossman, not just with normal block volumes, traditional block volumes, but with block productivities. And then observe what that does to the ultimate pit limits and the nested pits. In other words, can we start this process whereby the mineral processing routes and the implications of mineral processing in terms of time which is related to the comminution specifically, can we try to start integrating that upfront in terms of our, in this case, ultimate pit limit calculation? And clearly, if we want to do that in terms of the application of the Lurch-Grossman, we also need to go one step further. We need to put this into the block model. Is the block model telling us the differences in hardness on a local scale, which is required in order to do this kind of calculation in the mine planning stage? So, effectively, we need to think in terms of, can we measure the right properties to dimension our block model in such a way that we can apply the Lurch-Grossman algorithm in a way which allows us to obtain an optimum which may or may not be the same as we determined using the traditional approach. So clearly there are still steps like sequence optimization, design of RAM, scheduling, production, but what I would like to really to emphasize this morning is if we follow this approach of using different inputs to the Lurch-Grossman, we should be in a much better position to identify whether we are able to de-risk our projects in the case where we have been too optimistic, potentially, in terms of our assumptions about the homogeneity of the ore. Or we may also be able to identify that we can, if we have, for example, very fast ore and in very favorable locations and slow ore in less favorable locations, we may also be able to add volume. In other words, we may be able to improve the overall project volume as obtained through the Lurch-Grossman. So I think in terms of the innovation, what we therefore need is we need fit-for-purpose data collection. Metallurgical data collection at the resource estimation stage is not necessarily, shall we say, very common. So we need to think how we can use whatever metallurgical information we have to estimate that into the block model in the right places. We need to interpret that and also update it as a function of in real time. Luckily, as I've hopefully shown to you today, the Lurch-Grossman algorithm is very straightforward in its application. So rerunning the Lurch-Grossman is actually something which can be done also from a tactical perspective, not just from a strategic perspective. Clearly, finally, we need to think very carefully whether we can use proxies for the metallurgical parameters, throughput parameters. Can we, in other words, use other than geochemical parameters to do so, and find ways to make timely updates to our mine plans. I hope that I've managed to, in a nutshell, to plant a seed of perhaps using a tried and tested technique in a hopefully a more innovative way, which will be maybe also benefit from the ongoing development in geometallurgy to try and make use of harness the data collection facilities, the computing power, and also the ingenuity of the next generation of engineers to make mining better. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you for this nice presentation. We have some gifts in memory of this speech. Just a small announcement, the rock mechanics session that will take place here will be started after 5 minutes break. Bu salonda düzenlenecek kaya mekaniği oturumu 5 dakikalık aradan sonra başlayacaktır.
I'm glad you started late because I was